Inside Story on BFM 89.9.
Good evening. You're listening to Sharmilla, Ganesan and Lynn. Tonight, should we do away with blanket petrol subsidies?
So this is coming as the government has argued that these subsidies are simply not helping the right people. So we're going to investigate that a bit.
Tell us, should we do away with blanket petrol subsidies? You can call 77332900, tweet us at BFM Radio, send us a voice note or WhatsApp at our mobile number 018-789-8899. This is Inside Story. It is 6:07, and last Monday in Dewan Rakyat, the former second finance minister and current Titiwangsa MP Datuk Sri Johari Abdul Ghani told Parliament that targeted subsidies can't be put off any longer. So he pointed out that the government can't delay the rationalization of subsidies, that targeted subsidies needed to be implemented gradually. And if we look at some of the numbers, based on a study by Bank Negara Malaysia, only 4% of the B40 community actually benefits from these petrol subsidies, whereas on the other end of the spectrum, the T20 enjoy over a third of the petrol subsidy. So clearly, not doing what it's meant to do.
No, not doing what it's meant to do. And there are any number of reasons for why that is, right? Because while you could argue that everybody, to some degree or another, uses petrol or needs gas, there is a significant difference between being in a car and being on a bike. There are also differences in what types of cars, how large those gas tanks are, so all these sorts of things come into play. And you mentioned earlier that the size of the cost of the subsidies last year. And following on from that, Deputy Finance Minister Datuk Sri Ahmad Mazlan has also said that up to 17 billion ringgit can be saved for the government coffers if it were to implement a targeted subsidy for petrol. He did say that subsidies have helped many people affected by the rising cost of living, but that a targeted approach would help to prevent leakage. And of course, as we have seen reported on, the tremendous gap between the market price and subsidized prices have also increased the risk of smuggling activities, especially diesel.
So, that is a larger conversation about whether this is even a sustainable transportation system for us to be using overall. But we did have Johan Merican on the Breakfast Grill yesterday. He's the Treasurer Secretary General for the Minister of Finance. And when talking about targeted subsidies, he said one potential approach to consider would be perhaps to use ICs as a form of identification each time you purchase fuel. So if a person was part of an eligible group for a subsidy, they would be able to buy it at a lower price, if not a higher price. But he did say that something like this would require a bit of time to make sure that it was implemented properly.
Yes, actually the bureaucracy of it and the process of it has tripped up past conversations about this, right? Because we've talked about using e-wallets or providing gas vouchers, petrol vouchers through e-wallets. That has not necessarily, people can't always find their way towards making that make sense. And if you look at this IC idea, I see how it works, but it also involves, I imagine, now having to speak to a human being every time I go fill petrol, right?
You couldn't just now people just use their apps, right? You don't even have to, you don't have to communicate with anybody.
No, or you're just tapping your card at the kiosk and then you're on your way. So this, and this has been a common complaint in the past, not just on the side of us as users or drivers, but I think there needs to be really, really strong and sufficient discussion with people who run petrol stations, because that is a complaint that has come up in the past, that when these ideas have been floated out, that there wasn't enough consultation done with petrol stations across the country.
So with all that in mind, the question we are exploring today is simply this: should we do away with blanket petrol subsidies? You can call 77332900, send us a voice note or WhatsApp 018-789-8899, tweet us at BFM Radio. After this, we'll be speaking with Carmelo Ferlito, who's CEO of the Centre for Market Education. So keep it here on Inside Story, BFM 89.9.
Brave finance managers. BFM 89.9.
It is 6:14. You're listening to Inside Story with Sharmilla and Lynn, and we are talking about blanket petrol subsidies and whether it's time to move away from that towards a more targeted system. We'd like to hear from you. Should we do away with blanket petrol subsidies? Call 77332900. Send us a voice note or WhatsApp 018-789-8899. Tweet us at BFM Radio. Joining us now on the line is Carmelo Ferlito, CEO of the Center for Market Education. Carmelo, good to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
So let's start with a study by Bank Negara Malaysia, right, which says only 4% of our B40 community has actually benefited from the petrol subsidy, whereas the T20 enjoy over a third of the subsidy. Would you say that this means the subsidy has essentially been a failure?
Well, I think that I don't say anything new if I say that indeed the blanket subsidies are regressive. This has been told many times. Also, this result is not surprising considering the fact that probably the B40 use more often public transportation or motorcycle to commute. But I would say that the failure of blanket subsidies, even not in this kind of result, in this kind of statistics, but in the fact that, as it is very clear now, they put the country in a situation from which is very difficult to go out. This is, I think, is the real problem. Once introduced, once a mechanism enters into the consumption habits, it's very difficult to withdraw from that mechanism.
And if we look at the impact, Datuk Sri Johari Abdul Ghani recently pointed out that the government incurred 51 billion ringgit in subsidies for petrol, diesel, liquefied petroleum gas, cooking oil and others in 2022. Now, if you look back 5 years, in 2017, that figure was only 8.3 billion. What do you make of this huge increase in subsidy spending?
Well, this is obvious because the moment in which the price of these items like petrol eventually, which is produced by Malaysia, of course, this increased the revenues for the country, but the price for consumer is higher, and therefore the amount of money that the governments need to spend for those subsidies is also increasing. So this makes indeed also less predictable for the government to implement policies of cutting spending, because you cannot predict in advance the price of those commodities, and therefore the amount of revenues and costs for subsidies is very much fluctuating.
Now, just to get an understanding of our reliance on subsidies, what would we be paying for petrol if there were no subsidies at all?
I believe that a market price for petrol would be probably close to 3.5 ringgit per liter.
And you mentioned earlier on also that we've kind of locked ourselves into a system from which it's difficult to get out. So I know later on we're going to be talking about how it is that we can move on from this potentially. But based on what we know, if this were to continue, this blanket subsidy, could the government afford to keep it going in the long run?
I think that it will be very difficult, and we have seen also with the latest budget that there is an issue with operation expenditures in the government, so it becomes less and less sustainable with the amount of revenues that the government is having. Having said that, and I am strongly a supporter of moving toward a more targeted system, but this transition needs to be done very carefully, because also implemented targeted subsidies have a cost, which is the implementation cost, the enforcement cost. So we have to be sure that we abandon a system to go toward a better system and not toward a more complicated and an even more costly system.
Now, Deputy Finance Minister Datuk Sri Ahmad Maslan has said that up to 17 billion ringgit can be saved from the government coffers if we decide to implement a targeted subsidy for petrol. Could you walk us through the potential math behind that?
Well, I think that this should be asked to him and to his team. It's difficult to understand how this calculation was done, but I believe that they have calculated the removal of subsidies for certain income brackets. And in example, we can say that if these subsidies goes, as Bank Negara said, for 1/3 to the T20, we can say that by removing that subsidies from the T20, then we are saving 1/3 of the amount that we pay. So more or less, I think the reasoning behind is this one.
Do you think this is the right time to start making this transition?
I think it is for a series of reasons, and because we are at the beginning of a new government mandate. So when more brave decisions can be taken, we have a coalition which is also a unity government. So which has the consensus of a variety of political parties, and therefore this allow us to make a little bit more brave in the experiments. Although I do believe that we can't only think about targeted subsidies without considering a more general reform of government spending, so how we can act also on other aspects. As Professor Jomo recently said in an interview to The Edge, I find that his points were compelling. I mean, we can't put all our hopes in one bullet only.
So speaking of reform, so you mentioned reform to government spending, but the other component to this, of course, is that can we really start talking about increasing the price of petrol without getting our larger public transport ecosystem up to speed?
Yes, I agree with you. If we start, and I have in mind in particular the M40, that probably is the category that is going to suffer the most, because most probably the subsidies will be maintained for the B40, can be removed from the T20, but the T20 may not feel the pinch too much. What will be decided on the M40, I think, is the real question mark. And indeed, we need to strengthen the system of public transportation, but not only that, in general, the system of parking related with the public transportation. So the whole ecosystem that goes together with public transportation, our work culture, and I would say also our urban design that goes together with it.
And what kinds of challenges you think would the government face in determining who is entitled to more or less subsidies?
First, there is a challenge in terms of communication. So someone will be unhappy, obviously, and the government will have to deal with that unhappiness. This is the first point. The second point is to avoid misuse and abuse, to get people that are not entitled to benefit from the subsidies, and vice versa, to get people that have the right instead not to benefit from it. So the implementation part, I think, and most probably this is the reason why nothing has been done at this regard yet, because the implementation of the system is very much puzzling.
What would work best for us in terms of implementation? What mechanisms could we be looking at?
Well, I look with interest, and I have said this in other occasions, to a system of vouchers. So we can't think to identify people at the petrol station. Okay, this is, I think, is too complicated and too easy also to be bullied as a system. So exchanging, identity cards and etc. That's why I believe that we should probably try to go with a full market price at the petrol station, and instead send out vouchers to households that we believe are entitled to receive this kind of support. And I say voucher rather than cash handouts, simply because with the voucher system, you can generate also a market whereby a person that is entitled to the subsidies but doesn't really need it can sell that voucher to the neighbor or to someone else that maybe need more support. So this could be the emergence of a bottom-up solution Although I do believe that we need to carefully study the cost of implementation of such system before embracing the idea. I believe in this idea, but some more math needs to be done about it.
And how do you see this being received by Malaysians, especially those in the T20 or upper M40 who are likely going to be most affected?
Yeah, I'm probably not too afraid about the reaction of the T20. I'm more concerned about the M40 because they may be in that bridge category where they need and they don't need, and etc. So I would say that we should start implementing this in a simple way. So maybe we all agree that eventually the T20 can do without. And let's start from there. Something is better than nothing. Let's start soft, small, see how it works, and try to work and adjust the system while you are playing in the safe zone, and then extend the system only when you have fine-tuned it.
You mentioned earlier the importance of communication. What might be some other measures that are needed to get public support?
I think that it has to be communicated clearly that the current system is unsustainable in the long run. And what does it mean practically? It means that if we don't start reforming the system, our children, our grandchildren are going to pay a cost in terms of less development, less job opportunities, less growth, more unemployment for the country. So explaining that we are doing an effort now for the sake of future generations.
In closing, are there countries who have implemented something like this successfully, and what can we learn from them?
I think there is a bit difficult also to make comparisons because every country is a separate story. You have mentioned Johari Abdul Ghani, who in Parliament has quoted the system of Saudi Arabia. Another attempt has been done with less success in Mexico, in example. I would say that we should not really look outside, but look inside to what is the best system that can suit our country, which is specifically a producer of commodities, but not at the level in which, in example, Saudi Arabia is, where I think the oil revenues account for 55% of the GDP or something like that. So we can't simply model on that. We should find a solution that is more suitable with our peculiar condition.
Carmelo, thanks for speaking with us today.
Thanks to you. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
That was Carmelo Ferlito, CEO of the Centre for Market Education, weighing in on the doing away of blanket petrol subsidies and how we can move towards a more targeted system. We'd like to hear from you. Should we do away with blanket petrol subsidies? You can call 77332900, send us a voice note or WhatsApp 018-789-8899, tweet us at BFM Radio. I think we have time for a couple of messages.
Yes. Let's start with this one from M, who says, T20 and M40 pay tax and higher tax than the B40. It's not fair that they are not entitled to a petrol price subsidy.
So I think that sort of sidesteps the idea of what a subsidy is actually meant to be.
Yes, but don't you think that has to do with the communication?
No, I agree, right?
Of how people have traditionally thought of subsidies.
Yeah, because this presupposes that the tax goes towards offsetting the subsidy. But that's not really true. That's not what a subsidy is supposed to do. That's even not how taxation is supposed to work.
Yeah, because I think what's happened is that because most of us have never known anything but, it's become seen as a basic right of living and being in Malaysia, and therefore it gets associated with the other rights that your tax money pays for.
So in contrast, actually, very quickly, Zara says, oh my God, yes, let's get rid of the subsidies. Why should my tax pay for those driving around their Alphards and their Velfires? Okay, a more considered response. We need to take into account as well the climate externalities of fossil fuels. We need to move people away from cars and into public transport. The government should use those savings from reducing subsidies to improve our public transport. So those are actually two opposing arguments really being made about who is deserving of our subsidies. But we'd love to hear from you as well. Should we be doing away with blanket petrol subsidies? Call 77332900, send us a voice note or WhatsApp 018-789-8899, tweet us at BFM Radio.
Break from monotony. BFM 89.9.
It is 6:38. You're listening to Inside Story with Sharmilla and Lynn, and we're talking about petrol subsidies. We're asking you, should we do away with blanket petrol subsidies? Call 77332900, send us a voice note or WhatsApp 018-789-8899, tweet us at BFM Radio. To start things off, we do have a voice note. This is from Kenneth.
Hi, good evening, Sharmilla and Lynn. I think what I heard from other audiences about moving people to public transport, I would like to add on here on moving people from fossil fuel powered car to electrified powered cars, like the perhaps even blanket subsidies for fossil fuels like petrol, diesel, and liquefied petroleum gas. Maybe the subsidies amount should be reduced and to move people to electric or the EVs. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Kenneth. Whether we're talking about EVs or whether we're talking about better public transport, which all of them are, I think, good ideas, possible paths that we could be moving towards. I think the challenge here is that there is still going to be a significant interim period where people are increasingly not going to be able to afford petrol.
Yes. Not able to afford or certainly feeling the pinch.
Or conversely, the government not being able to afford the cost of the subsidies.
Yes, I agree with that. I also just wanted to point out that depending on what it is that you're worried about when it comes to the environment, Malaysia's electricity is still coal-based. So moving to EVs, while yes, in many ways appears to be the cleaner option, and you could make that argument, it's worth also, I guess, just going back to the source and considering where our electricity comes from.
We do have a caller on the line. Good evening, Jamal. What are your thoughts?
Hello, good evening, Sharmilla and Lynn. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Okay, for me, the blanket is okay, no problem, but it will be much better if we come out like ration apps, Actually, this one already been done in many countries, but it's been done manually. But why don't we do it by apps? Maybe we can use the MySejahtera or come up with the new apps or what. The government can include whatever, like the cost for the rice, cooking oil, of course the petrol, everything like that, according to their level of salary, like B40 or M40 or T20. So, and every month they can use that apps to spend their to buy by spending through their apps. And then if their budget allocation already finished for that month, so they need to wait for the next month. So in this way, the shopkeeper also no need to adjust or amend their price, or like the petrol station also no need to amend their price for B40 plur, I need to sell cheap, for T20 plur, I need to sell expensive. No need to adjust. So they just sell.
Oh, I believe we lost Jamal, but I do think he made his point. The idea of a ration-like system, potentially through an app or even MySejahtera.
Lots of people pointing out that My Sejahtera is something that can be used. Firstly, Jamal, thanks so much for calling. And if you're on the road, drive safe. It sounded like the weather was rough. But also, I think that these are some very solid ideas in terms of how we can approach it. It's intriguing to me to look at the split in communication that we're getting today, actually, because there is a pretty decent kind of down the middle line between people who are discussing firstly, whether or not we should have targeted subsidies, whether we should just maintain the subsidies, so on and so forth. And then on the flip side, there are people who've just moved on and gone into the realm of implementation, which is where Jamal was. I think I'm trying to picture it. I see where you're going with the app telling you how much you have left. I'm wondering about the self-reporting aspect a little bit of you putting in things like salary and stuff and how that's going to link up. I am still, I have to admit, I'm trying to think about how this works at the kiosk.
Yes, which is what it comes down to, right? And in a way, our guest earlier, Carmelo Ferlito, was trying to avoid putting the onus of it working on the petrol stations and the kiosk with his vouchers idea. But yeah, I agree. I think there are multiple layers here that no matter what we put in place will have to be worked out.
Speaking of, let's get into some of the conversations around IC and vouchers. So Jolyn says vouchers are archaic. The government should have a national welfare database that's linked with income tax and JPJ information, and then you use the IC as a validation method for subsidized petrol rates directly at the pump. The same welfare database can be used for the distribution of other subsidies that are directed to those who actually need it.
Not dissimilar, I think, to what Johan Merican, the Treasury Secretary General, suggested.
So, okay. Just to be clear, I realize that I'm maybe being a little bit 1980s about this. Not 1984, mind you. I'm not making a surveillance joke. It's just genuinely, I think my technology brain isn't there yet. So we're talking about the kiosk at the pump being able to read my IC. That's what we're talking about, right? That in other words, there would be a space for you because your IC does contain all sorts of information.
Yes.
So earlier we said that you would have to go present your IC to a person. They would pull up the database, the information would be there. But now with the messages, I think it's becoming clearer that what people are imagining, with good reason, I guess, is the possibility of software.
Well, see, the reason I didn't immediately jump to that is because I haven't even done the thing where you can integrate touch and go into your IC, where else I know a lot of people have. So I guess if you've already started thinking about your IC as a software-enabled, chip-enabled card, which it is, then yes, this is one way in which that can be used.
Hey, can I insert a needless tangent? But if you think about the recent moves by the Transport Ministry to move away from us having to carry physical driving licenses, to move away from having to carry, stick the road tax. I'm thinking that at the time there were a lot of calls for our IC. Okay, I know this was divisive. Even when we talked about it on the show, it was divisive. But there have been a lot of calls for the IC to also be appified and for us to no longer have to worry about losing it, so on and so forth. I'm just thinking about how much integration is going to be required as we move towards like an increasingly techie connected situation. Because if we end up using the IC as a way to determine whether you get fuel subsidies, but eventually we move away from carrying an IC, then we're in a whole new realm of how will this work?
Well, okay, a lot of people are bringing up suggestions that involve tech and ICs and so on. Lukman's one is a little bit, for me at least, a little bit daunting. Lukman says, using the IC is too complicated. It's better to use a debit or credit card. Banks have records of the owner. The government can link this info to ICs. That is where I start feeling like it gets a little 1984.
1984. It's no longer just the 80s.
No.
Now we're firmly in like
because now
Big
your
Brother.
entire financial profile. I mean, I'm not saying this is what's going to happen, but with Lukman's suggestion, we're potentially talking about financial profile being attached to your IC.
Yeah, and that was a worry for me constantly. Actually, how much information exactly are we going to provide, or are we going to have to provide just to be able to fill a tank of petrol?
So we are talking about petrol subsidies and whether we should do away with blanket petrol subsidies. But we are also getting suggestions on how best to implement targeted subsidies. If you'd like to weigh in, You can call 77332900, send us a voice note or WhatsApp 018-789-8899, tweet us at BFM Radio.
Bribe-free Malaysia? BFM 89.9, the business station.
It's 6:48. You're listening to Inside Story with Sharmilla and Lynn, and we're talking about whether we should do away with blanket petrol subsidies. We're getting plenty of thoughts. Send yours through as well. That number to call, 77332900. A voice note or WhatsApp us at 018-789-8899. Tweet us at BFM Radio. So we've got plenty of people on either side of the divide. Some saying yes, remove the subsidies. Some saying no, they should stay. Let's start with this from Richard, who says we should remove blanket subsidies, but we should also take care of those who can't afford it. I would suggest that we remove subsidies for RON 95, replace it with RON 88, RON 90. These petrol grades are not suitable for newer or turbocharged cars, but should be sufficient for regular motorcycles and cheaper Peroduas and Protons. This is just my 2 cents.
Interesting. Just a generally interesting suggestion, partly because I have to admit that when I saw RON 88, I was like, whoa. It's just we've gotten so used to only having the two.
Well, remember when they taught us through public education campaigns that 97 and 95 were different?
Yes.
That in itself was enough to blow my mind. So this is a whole new layer.
I think I like the idea of this, although again, and I'm going to sound a bit like a broken record, and perhaps this is something that, not perhaps, I think this is something that we will look into next time on the show, because we have spoken to the Association of petrol stations before. And I think that having their perspective on this would actually be very helpful, because we are talking about immense changes to their industry, whether it is through the IC system or voucher system, whether we're talking about replacing RON 88, RON 90 as opposed to 95, 97. I know that involves different departments. I'm just saying that I think it would be next. That's what we'll do. We'll get an industry look at this, because I think that's valuable.
We also have on the other side of it, Dreadmond saying all Malaysians should be treated equally, be it T20, M40 and B40. The T20 are already paying higher percentage of taxes. I agree to remove subsidies for all and help the B40 in other ways, for example, by raising the minimum income or the minimum wage.
Okay, so I think that there are a few things to look at there. I have noticed that this is a little bit of this has been a little bit of a rallying cry. All Malaysians should be treated equally, no matter what level you're at. And while I can see that, I think that sometimes we're not acknowledging the very different ways in which we live and occupy space in this country, and that treating everyone equally isn't the same when everybody's challenges are different. In other words, those equal treatments don't all affect people equally. They don't have an equal amount of impact. And not acknowledging that also I'm not sure that's the way to go.
So I think also folded into this is discussions of how are we even coming up with these categories, right? Which a number of people are bringing up. So Stephen says, what is the definition of T20, M40, B40? I will be 60 this year. My income is not taxable. I'm not eligible for Bantuan Sara Hidup. I was told to appeal when a window emerges. That was before GE15. Who gets the fuel subsidy? How does full price fuel then affect our food prices? Is another spiral of inflation forthcoming? Surely bank interest rates will then have to rise perpetuating a vicious cycle.
We don't have the answer to that, Stephen. But what strikes me about this is the need, and this is something that was mentioned earlier, the need for proper government communication on this, because you're not alone in asking questions about the inflation, asking questions about food prices, about how this will affect other costs in our country. And so it's one thing at the moment. At the moment, the conversations that are happening are very top level. They are all about how this will save the government money and therefore in the long run save the people money. That's not enough, I think, for people who are drawing up their monthly budgets and worrying about, wait, you're telling me that I'm M40 now, because I'm struggling to make ends meet because, for example, I live in KL, which is a point that LH is bringing up. To be honest, the M40 is also struggling to survive because of the hike of living costs. Plus, a person who's M40 in a rural area is not the same as someone who is M40 in the city like KL. The first step ahead is to reset the definition of M40 as the difference between rural and city is drastic.
No, so those are all actually very relevant points, which then goes back to how do we fairly decide who deserves a subsidy and who doesn't. And I think that question, so there's so many layers here that are quite complicated to explain, right? If we talk about who gets it is one, then how do we implement is the other. How do we implement in a way that is sustainable in the long run is the third level. So, I mean, we're not offering solutions per se, but I do think that we, at least from the government's perspective, we can collectively agree that the blanket subsidy isn't really doing its job. So what is the alternative that we could be looking towards? We do have a voice note that's come in. This is from Danny.
Taxes are meant to develop the country, whether it be to build infrastructure or to fund subsidies. Therefore, I think it's erroneous to say that taxes should not be used to fund subsidies.
Thank you for that, Danny. So I'm not sure whether you were referring to us or to one of our messages that we were reading earlier. I think that, in fact, what we were saying is that taxes shouldn't, the through line isn't necessarily I pay tax, therefore I deserve a subsidy, which is the argument that's being made in terms of being against the notion of removing a blanket subsidy.
Yeah. We also have a lot of people pointing out the correlation between cars and the subsidies. So there are arguments being made, for example, by Chris, who says, yes, no blanket subsidies. All luxury cars, for example, those above 200K, must pump unsubsidized RON 97. Cheaper cars can pump subsidized RON 95. We also have actually some others. We'll get to them. But Chris is making an argument that others are as well.
This is an interesting one. I wonder how that might change people's decisions on what cars they drive, because ultimately then it will mean that despite what you earn, you can actually get away with a much lower price for petrol just by making a decision on what car to drive.
Yes. So that's the thing, right? Anil is making kind of a similar point, saying, don't you think this will then lead to tax evasion because people from the T20 will try to become B40? And, I would hope that petrol subsidies alone are not enough to drive people to this level of thinking, right? But I think that your point about the car is a very valid one, because if I am wealthy enough, I can afford to have my cheap petrol car and my fancy car.
You say you hope it doesn't drive people to this. However, clearly listeners are already extrapolating that some people will think of it, because Didi on Twitter is saying, can I get my retired mother to pump my car petrol using her IC?
Probably.
I mean, that's really it, right? Because I was asking us off air what it means if you use your IC to fill your car up with petrol, because essentially you can hand that IC over to anybody unless there's a person checking to make sure you are that person. And again, that adds a layer.
Well, there was a message a little bit earlier, which I now can't find, which asked the question of facial ID. Whether that's something that we should consider using, or thumbprints. In other words, that yes, you can put your IC. So for example, again, if we do away with the having to go speak to a person and they identify you with your face, then we're talking about identifying yourself at the pump.
So that point about cars and different petrol prices, Shazu says, use plate number sensors at petrol stations, integrate this with your JPJ record, identify a car type model, assign prices based on car. If you can afford an expensive car, you should be able to pay for the petrol as well. Income bracket subsidy won't be quite fair if one were to have a high commitment, even with a high salary.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm a little bit hesitant about the amount of integration that we're talking about here. Although I understand that this is actually a technology convenience conversation. It's not necessarily just a petrol conversation. But I hear you. I think it's interesting. We also have Lunix making the same point as we heard earlier from LH, who says, I think, if they're going to remove the blanket petrol subsidy, they need to redefine M40 and T20 based on states. A household earning 10K may be defined as T20 in states like Kedah, Terengganu, but it's just M40 in KL and Selangor due to higher expenses. They should not have a blanket B40, M40, T20 definition for the whole country. And also, if you're a real T20, you're probably driving a car where the performance can't be powered by RON 95, so you're already paying for RON 97.
Well, okay, so for that last part, as our guest earlier said, he's not so concerned about the T20 anyway, because the removal of the subsidy isn't really going to affect the upper T20.
Yes. Yeah, I was going to say.
I decided to correct myself. However, I think if we're talking about the M40, possibly even the M60, then the concerns become a lot higher. But to go back to the state-based challenge, that's a question not just about petrol subsidies, but in general, how we think of welfare and how we allocate needs-based finance.
Yeah. And the fact that we often go nationwide and that therefore that has people feeling really the squeeze and feeling like there's no way to communicate that squeeze. This was something that came up even in the budget and taxation. So I think it's a running theme. It's probably something we're going to continue exploring throughout the year.
Keep those thoughts coming. We'll get to them after this. Should we do away with blanket petrol subsidies? Call 77332900, send a voice note or WhatsApp 018-789-8899. Tweet us at BFM Radio.
Bring forth money. BFM 89.9.
It is 7:07. You're listening to Inside Story with Sharmilla and Lynn, and we're asking you, should we do away with blanket petrol subsidies? You can call us, you can send us a voice note, you can WhatsApp us, you can tweet us. We have plenty of thoughts coming through, but we do have a caller on the line. Good evening, Adi. What are your thoughts?
Hey, hi, good evening.
Good evening.
Hi. Firstly, before I share my thoughts, do you guys use 95 or 97?
I use 95.
Same, yeah.
Okay. All right. To me, because I'm actually running a mini government at home, my household. I mean, the concept is more or less the same. I'm the sole breadwinner. I have to distribute. One of my primary role is to distribute the wealth to my household, to my kids and to my wife. If everybody is treated equally, then obviously, because I have one in uni, I have 3 kids, one in uni, one in a teenager in the secondary school, one in primary school. So I can't give everybody equal the pocket money. And obviously to my wife, it has to be a different kind of allowance, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to be targeted in that sense. And I'm okay to do away with the blanket. It has to be targeted. The concept is also simple that whoever is richer is getting more, then it should be helping the poor, and it has to be targeted because for my household, I mean, everybody has their own needs, at least to satisfy their basic needs. The one in uni probably need more money because their activities are a lot different from the one in primary. So, I mean, the government has all this information. I mean, what I'm suggesting is they should be working on it to get all the profile of our citizens. I mean, there are so many sources to determine. And in fact, when we introduced in 1999 self-declaration of income tax, of course, there are some leakages here and there are opportunity loss in terms of income, but we started it. I mean, it moved on. Everybody self-declare. So, I mean, it should start somewhere rather than wait and we have a lot of issues, concern, how to implement this. There will be some invasion and so on. So, might as well just progress and start with it. That's my opinion.
Fair enough, Adi. Before you go, I wanted to ask you actually back the question you asked us, which is RON 95 or 97?
Me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm 97.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much for calling.
Thank you for that, Adi. I love that analogy of the family and how different people within that ecosystem have different needs and therefore need to be addressed differently.
Yes, but I also think that one thing that I really liked was the idea of just do it lah. Partly because I do think that we have become so deeply reliant on it, and we have started to take it as a sort of just this is how things are, that, if there isn't forward motion on it, we honestly will never. I do agree with that. It's not even a question of political will, because most of the administrations, I say most because suddenly we have so many to choose from, but most of the administrations at some point or another have brought it up, have mentioned it, have said that we just can't be doing with this anymore. So it's not necessarily political will. I think part of it is just bureaucratic problems. We haven't figured out the system. And then also it's an anticipation that the people are going to be extremely unhappy with it.
So that was what I was going to say, that nobody wants to be the unpopular guy, the one who introduced the unpopular move, even though we all can agree that in the long run, that's probably going to be the best, but you don't want to be the one to have it, to introduce it. In a way, it does seem like that. We do have some other voice notes that have come in. So let's hear this one from Alfred.
Hi BFM, hi Sharmilla and Lynn. I like to add on to the conversations. I think targeted subsidies for fuel is great, but I hope that the government would do it in a way that it will not affect the economy very much. I hope the interim period would be at least a 5 years time, maybe reducing it by 20% per year. And I hope that we could come out with an arrangement that maybe the food industry or the transportation industry would continue to enjoy like a fair amount of subsidy, and reduce the subsidy gradually. Otherwise, it will cause a shock to the economy. But for retail, yes, I do agree that the T20, the M40, we shouldn't really get that much of a subsidy. But again, I hope that it would be gradual in any case. So yeah.
Alfred, thank you for that. Just to add on, we had a tweet from Rizzo making a similar point, saying, how will this affect vehicles belonging to businesses and companies? How will this affect the price of products and services?
And I would add on to that, then how are we going to include these nuances in the implementation? Because that's where my head is at the moment. So if we are decided that we are going to do away with it, but we accept that industries are part of the targeted subsidies, then just how exactly we're going to take that into account, I think, is something that I'm quite interested to see. The other thing I wanted to mention about Alfred's point, because Alfred's one of the first few people to mention M40.
Yes.
In the idea that even if you're M40, you could do away with it. And I'm inclined towards thinking that M40 is too broad a category.
It is increasingly starting to seem that way, right? Because one could argue that many in the M40 might already be using RON 97, and therefore this wouldn't necessarily affect them. But then which end of the M40 are you talking about? And what if we include the B60 category?
Yes. Yeah. So I hadn't even considered the idea that people were already using RON 97. I was purely stuck on the B60. And the fact that household income is a term that we use quite lightly, but as people are, kind of bringing up examples, it's quite clear that household income, quote unquote, can be at a certain level, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the size of your household or where you live.
So on that point about income levels, income groups, we do have another voice note. This is from Jingye.
I think in categorizing M40, B40 and T20 have to be careful because certain people that stay in rural areas or urban areas, the categorization may be different. So, and it's difficult as well to implement this sort of target subsidy based on your income group level because essentially you have to share this data with the petrol stations, with the petrol companies as well, which may or may not be dangerous because, nowadays we have all these data leaks. So I think one consideration that can be taken into account if we want to implement targeted subsidies is to look at the type of cars that are being driven, because usually rich people, if they want to drive a BMW and Mercedes, is all about the appearance and all that, so they wouldn't mind spending that sort of amount. So yeah,
I will confess that until we started doing the show, I never thought about a targeted subsidy system based on car type.
Yeah. Although I had only because every time we've talked about it on air, this suggestion has come up. And I think there are a lot of reasons for this. Partly the perception that Jingyi just discussed, right? This idea that if you can afford this kind of car, then you can afford to pay the unsubsidized petrol. That's just, it's as simple as that. I think the other thing is also the perception of what a rich person is. And rich person is a more loaded term than T20, I think, because as we've seen from certain examples, a T20 person in the Klang Valley supporting maybe 4 other members of their household being the sole breadwinner, it's not all that much. You know, if you realistically look at the expenses of the month, and that might not be the case. Rich person, though, you don't need to kind of qualify or justify too much.
The point about the data leak and also who has access to your financial information, depending on which system we end up going with, is also quite a important one. And I think it goes back to the notion of communication, of making sure that all of this is communicated to people if it's something that we put in place. In the meantime, we will be back after this. Keep those thoughts coming. Should we do away with blanket petrol subsidies? You can call us, you can send us a voice note, you can WhatsApp us, you can tweet us, and keep it here, BFM 89.9.
Building First World Malaysians. BFM 89.9, the business station.
It is 7:18. You're listening to Inside Story with Sharmilla and Lynn, and we are continuing our conversation on blanket petrol subsidies. Should we do away with them? Send your thoughts through. You can call us, you can send us a voice note, you can WhatsApp us, you can tweet us. We do have a caller on the line. Good evening, Kay. What are your thoughts?
Okay, very simple. I'm earning $500,000 a year today in income, for example, But the day I retire, I'll be having zero income. But I have enough wealth for the next 3 generations. So I'm still considered a B40, right? Question mark. Because it's just plain income. So forget about $500,000, 150,000. Next question is, I'm okay to remove subsidies for petrol at every level, but please, for heaven's sake, get the public transport into place. Everyday LRT problem, no buses. That's all. That's a pain point we have.
Thank you for your thoughts, Kay. I feel very strongly about the public transport issue because I think moving towards charging more for petrol has to mean that you have to offer an alternative. And if you don't, then what is the solution?
Yes, I agree with that. I was still stuck on the point about how somebody who is ostensibly wealthy could in fact be categorized as a B40.
Yeah.
And these things are true.
And those are the questions that actually so many listeners are bringing up in terms of how we're categorizing this in the first place.
Yeah, and one would hope, that we've got some smart beans over there in the Ministry of Finance who would actually be taking a proper look at and not, I think, hopefully not falling back to these categories, which, to be honest, I mean, we use them all the time as a shorthand. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend that from the first moment that B40, M40, T20 were introduced to the lexicon, that people were okay with it. Because people have never been okay with it. There have been these exact conversations the entire time. And in fact, they're only ramping up because it appears that we're using them truly for policy.
Perhaps this is a future show that we need to think about, rethinking these categorizations. We do have, we do have another voice note that's come in. This is Azmin.
Rather than removing the fuel subsidy, just introduce GST at higher rate. So the net effect, to the government, is the same. You increase the revenue. So maintain the fuel subsidy. Easier to implement GST.
Thank you for that, Azmin. So there have been a number of messages on this vein, actually. Maintain the fuel subsidy, find other ways to increase revenue. My question would be actually how and from where? Because the government has pointed out several times that a lot of tightening of the belt has to be done.
Okay, so it's how from where, and then I think also this is something that we haven't explored that much today, but maybe it's also the question of what is the true value of continuing to have the subsidy as a blanket? For us collectively, what is the true value of it? Is it just because it eases some parts of our lives and acknowledging that there is a rising cost of living, so some ease in some places is a good thing, is a much needed thing. Is that enough to justify the cost of the subsidy? So even if you were to take the stance that you can find revenue in other ways, does that then come with the argument that we shouldn't save money where we can, which I'm not sure necessarily they correlate?
Yeah, and especially because also what the government and the finance ministry is talking about is also about the amount of savings that we can we potentially have by doing away with blanket subsidies, which is not a small amount.
I really wanted to get to this voice note actually that came in from Roberto, because it is the first suggestion that I can fully picture from beginning to end. I don't know if that necessarily makes it the best one, just that I can picture it. Here's Roberto.
I guess one way to implement the targeted subsidies will be through a kind of debit card. No, I mean, not really a debit card, but a card where the government, which has already identified who are the B40s and the M40s, can distribute it with the necessary amount according to the needs or the usage of the user. I mean, it's kind of like a debit card, you know what I mean? So the government will deposit every month certain amount that could be used only to the petrol station. So instead of paying with their own money, they can use the card to pay. You know what I mean? So that somehow eliminates the hassle of trying to identify whatever, because ultimately, again, the government is already implementing a lot of different subsidies targeting this specific sector of the population. So I guess it will be and it's kind of in line with the idea of the voucher, with the difference that you cannot sell this voucher because you will need to get rid of your card. You know what I mean?
Thank you for that, Roberto. I agree with Lynn. I think that actually sounds like a very doable way and a very easy way for people to make use of.
Yes, I would only say that I don't understand enough about how the payment system, payment gateway works at the petrol station to know whether this would involve a huge overhaul for them.
That's true. However, if I'm understanding Roberto correctly, he seems to be suggesting it would work similar to a debit card.
Yes,
for which they already have facilities for, I would think.
Yes, so they have facilities for debit cards that link up to the banks, and you know, so I just don't know whether that's the exact thing that we're discussing. But otherwise, yes, I think if you have a standard petrol card that you can use. And then we go back to the earlier point raised. It's such a long show now. I can't remember from who, but or maybe from a few people, that you have only a certain amount.
Yes.
And you know, that's the amount that you have. It's based on your income. It's based on our understanding of how much you need. And then after that and beyond that, you'll have to pay your own way.
Which I suppose is one way to do it, and in a way that doesn't seem so... I think I come back to usability and whether for the person using it as well as the petrol station that is implementing it. Let's see. We have Sueng saying, on the assumption that people who drive schmancy cars can afford to pay for unsubsidized petrol, have you seen the kinds of cars that will park illegally, especially outside shops, rather than pay for parking?
Well, I mean, Roe, for example, saying targeting subsidies based on car type sounds like a cunning plan from Baldrick, especially when my 2-decade-old Porsche costs half the price of a new X50.
Well, that is actually a point that I hadn't necessarily thought of.
I have thought of it partly because, I'm not driving actually a fancy car, a schmancy, to quote Sueng car at all, but it is an older one. And so I think the question again of What exactly is considered a car that, we're going to say, hey, these brands, you're going to have to do this, and this model, you're going to have to do that?
We have a voice note from Hussein.
My name is Hussein. Well, I do not trust the government to be able to use that savings of $17 billion correctly, because the government themselves have got a record of leakages. So these savings that they intend to make through the petrol subsidies removal for the T20, what makes you think that they will actually use the money properly? And so the history doesn't show the track record. No doubt this is a new government, but we do not know this government and what they will be doing with the money.
Thank you for that, Hussein. I think you raise an important point about accountability and transparency. And I agree that we don't necessarily have... We do, okay, I'm just going to say it. We have a trust deficit when it comes to the government, a number of governments, not just the current one. But I do think that going back to exactly that point, it is a new government. It seems like a good time to put in place policies that perhaps we've struggled with implementing in the past.
I would like... I feel like now is a bad time to bring this up. My worry is that we have seen U-turns before, and not U-turns from the same government, but sometimes U-turns from a different government. And I do feel, I'm so worried that there's going to be all this hard work put into the communicating, doing the math, figuring out that we need to wean ourselves off subsidies, which I think in general, we can agree, I hope we can agree that getting off blanket subsidies is something that is generally speaking good for us, provided it comes with all these other things, that our wages go up, that our public transportation goes up. And I'm worried that this will then be used as a political tool to say, hey, if we come back, you will have, subsidized petrol, and then we will go back to the way things were. And I think it's a tough one, because I feel as if we're almost there, but it could so easily kind of just turn around.
That's actually such an interesting point, because, yes, I think when you talk about what is popular, when you talk about what might get you votes, the government that brings back the petrol subsidy could potentially win a lot of short-term
That's what I'm
goodwill,
saying.
right?
Yes.
And yeah, I agree that
You
the
see
last
it with
thing...
GST.
Oh, yes, that's such a great comparison. And that's the last thing I want with something like this, which we've been talking about for years now, and moving towards, apparently, in very, very small baby steps. We are running out of time, but if you'd like to continue weighing in, do send your thoughts through. We've been talking about whether we should do away with blanket petrol subsidies. You can send us a voice note, you can WhatsApp us, you can tweet us, and keep it here, BFM 89.9.